Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today for this kickoff event for the World Access to Higher Education Day. My name is Roberta Malee Bassett. I'm the global lead for tertiary education at the World Bank. And it's my pleasure to be able to chair this session today, which is going to highlight a new report published by several of the speakers today and the WAHED team. And the session today is called, Is There an Equity Crisis? Higher Education Access and Success to 2030. This is a session where we'll discuss some of the findings of a new report that's been launched today and was featured in a University World News or Times Higher, University World News piece that was published today. And we want to introduce to the audience some of the key findings of this piece, which include impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, institutional closures, and other challenges that were brought to the front of higher education delivery during COVID, and how those impacted especially the least connected, most vulnerable population among our students. And so this event today will bring together global leaders in higher education to examine the launch of this report, The Equity Crisis, Higher Education Access and Success in 2030. It's the outcome of a year-long research project that featured interventions and contributions from policymakers, students, and NGOs on the progress of equitable access and success in higher education. It will outline a series of calls to action around leadership, targets, and investments designed to galvanize the global higher education equity community. We welcome you all to this conversation today. For my part, just to introduce some of my own World Bank work on this issue, equity has been a huge part of the World Bank's efforts to support higher education expansion and reforms around the globe. As many of you may know, the World Bank is the largest external financer of higher education reforms globally, and to the tune of about $9 billion since 2015. In each of these projects that we support and all of our research, we do pay a lot of attention and care about equity considerations. That includes gender equity, but also equity to underserved populations, rural populations, marginalized groups, and those who are displaced internally or cross-border. So this is a major issue of concern of ours. We know there is a massive development impact when those who should have access to higher education are denied that access. And so we look forward to publications like this, to the efforts of Grant Atherton and his team, to all of our colleagues on this call today, and they're learning about the work that is done to improve equitable access to higher education so that we can use this knowledge and use some of these techniques and interventions to improve the experiences of our client countries around the world as well. And so with that very quick opening, I will turn now to Malcolm Butler, and I'll give a brief introduction and the bio of Malcolm. Dr. Malcolm Butler is the Vice President and Director of Global Engagement at the University of Sheffield. Dr. Butler leads on the international aspects of the university's strategy and is Director of the Department of Global Engagement. The department is responsible for building strategic academic partnerships across research and education, managing global opportunities for students, encouraging international mobility among staff, and supporting innovation globally. He's graduated with a degree in physics from the University of Warwick and completed his PhD in engineering materials at the University of Sheffield. I want to welcome Dr. Butler and look forward to hearing your thoughts and your reflections on this piece for this session today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Roberta, for that introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, or even good night to our audience, wherever you are from in the world. The spread of participants is part of the joy of these events, to know that we're reaching out to many areas. As Roberta said, I'm from the University of Sheffield, but I'm actually here as the chair of trustees of the Northern Consortium, who funded part of this work. And so I'm delighted to be here to speak at this event and to introduce the work that is the outcome of that funding. By way of background, the Northern Consortium was founded in 1993 from an alliance of UK universities across the north of England, who shared a belief in the long-term benefits of international education and the commitment to widening participation. And my university, Sheffield, is one of those. So hopefully you can see why we are part of this. And we may be part of the solution and possibly part of the problem as well. Access to higher education is very much at the heart of the Northern Consortium as a charity. That is what we are here to do. And our sort of charitable objectives are about facilitating access to international education, promoting the benefits of international education, and enabling educational engagement, particularly from students from disadvantaged groups, wherever they might be globally. We also have a subsidiary set up in 2003 called Northern NC UK Limited. And this operates across the globe in terms of centres that start the education of students and then bring them to universities in the UK. I mention them because they've assisted 40,000 students in their route into higher education since 2003. So you'll see why Northern Consortium has funded this research project on the equity crisis, higher education access and success to 2030. But for information, we also fund other areas of research, student scholarships, and opportunities for global engagement. And you can check our website for details if you're interested in finding more or applying for that. So some of the audience might be interested in that area. As a founding member of the Northern Consortium, the University of Sheffield has always been very interested in the internationalisation of higher education and very much involved in initiatives around this. We were the founders of the We Are International campaign, celebrating the academic, economic and cultural benefits of international students and what they bring to the UK. A campaign that is now led nationally by UKISA, the UK Council for International Student Affairs. And again, that's just one example, but we are committed as a university to internationalisation and therefore our support to the Northern Consortium and to the support of work such as this and world access to higher education. Today, we're about the launch of the report by Professor Atherton on, as I said, the equity crisis, higher education, access and success to 2030. The most scary thing about it is that 2030 is a lot closer than it seems when you look at some of the challenges that we face. And of course, that all relates back to the development goals that we have. We're very proud to sponsor this report, and the fact that it addresses the understanding of equitable access to higher education across the globe. Fundamentally, I believe, and I'm sure many others here do, that understanding the issues and the challenges that face us in terms of widening the access will inform not only the future focus of Northern Consortium, who I'm representing, but hopefully other organisations, institutions and governments, and how we can all together address the inequalities that clearly exist. And I hope many of you in the audience will be thinking about how you can contribute to what you hear today, and I'll return to that shortly. On top of that, the report very much highlights the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and whilst this has in fact impacted negatively in so many ways across the world, it has also compounded the existing inequalities in terms of access to education, and becomes a very specific part of the problem from that pandemic that we are still all recovering from. In terms of the report itself, the Equity Crisis Report shines a light, we like to think, on the global problem of equal access to higher education, and the challenges of successful participation in graduate outcomes. Education and the exchange of knowledge for the benefit of all is at the heart of higher education, whichever country you are in. And is a key driver, as I said, for us at the Northern Consortium and the University of Sheffield, and I hope many in the audience. Professor Atherton's insightful and evidence-based report clearly sets out a course of action as well to solve the equity crisis. And I think this is a particular part of the report that people should pay attention to, as I say, to see how we can contribute. In brief summary, although you'll get more details shortly from Graham himself, in case you haven't spotted that he's in the screen there, but it does talk about the impressive range of data that has been gathered from a wide range of sources across the globe. It identifies where gaps exist, and significantly also in where gaps exist in the data in terms of our ability to assess and monitor some of the issues. It highlights some areas where there are achievements and good practice, and also areas where more is required and where there are deficiencies to be looked at. As I've mentioned, the impact of COVID-19 is talked about, and how that impacts on equitable access. And towards the end of the report, gets very much into specific actions around proposals, whether they be policy changes, things like digital access, data collection, as I said, and of course funding is also often a source to how we resolve many of these things. I think most importantly for me is that it concludes that we can contribute, and it gives some calls to action around our ability to lead by example and inspire others to action, to set and share targets to increase commitment and ensure accountability to how we measure and therefore improve access to education, but also encourage us to dedicate and invest resources, whether it be financial or otherwise in terms of time, in order to be able to deliver some of the things that we would like to achieve. I too am a fundamental believer that working together is the way we achieve equity and address these issues as an economic and social imperative that can only be for the benefit of the wider globe. And there are enough challenges around the wider globe to know that we will need to work together to solve all of these. So if I may, in conclusion, I've mentioned that the Northern Consortium obviously is committed to engaging in charitable activities such as this, and we want to explore, address and remove barriers to accessing global higher education. Our appreciation is very much expressed to Graham for his drive and determination in shining a light on the equity issues that are highlighted in his report. I said I will return to this, and I want to mention that we have a mixed audience here today from many walks of life and from many countries around the world. But I challenge you to think about what you hear today and the report and the discussion, and identify where you can contribute in terms of the calls to action that Graham has identified, whether that be to lead, to target, or to invest, or perhaps maybe all three of those areas in terms of a call to action. So thank you for listening. Enjoy reading the report. I hope there was a fruitful discussion today from today's gathering. And I'll, I think, hand over to Graham or maybe Roberta to give more details on the report itself and kick off the discussion. So thank you very much. And thank you. Have a great day today.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. And I know we don't get you for very long, so let me just pose one question to you, just so that we get to use you to your fullest while we do have you with us. And we do have a little time since we're running a little ahead. I'd like to hear a bit more actually on the your perspectives from the University of Sheffield's perspective on this connection between internationalization and equity. And I think this is a really important one, as we have a global audience here, as we, I think, are of like minds that internationalization is a key element of modern higher education, that we really can't offer students a comprehensive higher education experience without at least incorporating some form of internationalization. But often equity is lost in that conversation because very often marginalized students aren't taking part in this internationalization exercise, study abroad, international curricula, et cetera. I'd love to hear a bit from the University of Sheffield and the efforts that you have on campus, how you kind of go about addressing those types of balances in this narrative around internationalization and equity.
Okay, thank you. Be careful what you wish for and stop me if I go on too long. So you know, internationalization as a university, as any university, not just Sheffield, is a core part of the education we give. It is fundamental to making our students, when they finish with us, not only academically capable, which is the obvious bit, but absolutely a global citizen who can then go out and contribute to the world in whatever way that is, whether that be economically, socially, whether it be in the UK or in another country where they come from or where they choose to go to. So that is sort of, I believe, an absolutely fundamental part of higher education and mustn't be forgotten. I think there's two very big issues around that in terms of how we make it happen. One is in terms of the community we create on a campus, and that is about two groups: the group of staff and making sure we have international range of staff that give that exposure to those thoughts, those cultures, those ideologies, those ways of thinking. But very much also, probably for the student experience perspective, it's about how we get a great mix of students from around the world to ensure that they can experience each other's cultures and have discussions with different perspectives and different upbringings and different backgrounds that really is at the heart of a proper education in terms of understanding and debating issues. So we encourage that happen. I think, as you say, the challenges is how we get the equitable access, both to get students to universities, and of course ourselves, not just the Northern Consortium, but as a university ourselves, We have ranges of scholarships and so on that help to facilitate that, and other organizations that we do too. We have generous alumni who give donations often focused on particular underrepresented groups, from various backgrounds, which generously helps to bring people into that fold. You mentioned study abroad as well, and that is one of the real challenges, I think, because for us in the UK, we have UK students who come here from disadvantaged backgrounds who may have managed to get to university, but can they then have that true global experience? And we think a year abroad or even just a 2-week summer school can be life-changing in terms of what it gives you in terms of a global perspective. And again, we try and fund some of that because, of course, often when you're talking about disadvantage, money is one of the big disadvantages. So funding that by ourselves through the Turing scheme, but also just giving people the confidence to do it is sometimes one of the barriers to getting them to take that first step into a global experience that could really open their eyes, change the direction of their lives, and really give them far more opportunities. 2 final points, if I may. I did warn you. I also think what we achieve as a university is important. So you talk about all the people we bring here, and clearly our job is about research, and you asked how we contribute to equitable access and to equity generally. And obviously, as a university, we like to think we are solving some of the global problems, whether that be energy, food, education in other places. We work with universities across the world, often in terms of developing them as well as research partnerships. So there's things there we as a university like to contribute, which are generally in the longer term and the baseline and the fundamentals. But we do believe in translating those into real world solutions to things. And then the same on the educational side. Like I say, we strive to get students here, but equally we strive to help other universities develop and to educate students in the countries where they exist, because often the travel and the coming to a new country is a barrier in itself, whether that be, as I say, a money thing, a confidence thing, a language thing, a cultural thing. So that's another way where we hopefully contribute to the wider equitable access as well as equity more general. So yes, a few thoughts. Hope that answered the question. Really fantastic. And I know we are now among all like minds. We all care, everyone who's joined this session, you who are leading this panel, of these exact issues. This is really important. And I think in a lot of the conversations around equity, which we engage in every day, these are the intangibles of the university experience that are often lost in the equity conversations. What are they accessing besides the classroom seat that we are so glad they have? But is their experience as rich and meaningful as any other students? That's something we all work really hard to improve. So thank you so much. If anyone who is participating has a question for Dr. Butler, please put it into the Q&A. We can't have him monitoring the chat, but he will be able to see the Q&A because the chat has too many people in it, I think. So thank you again very much, Malcolm. And I hope you can stick around just a little bit longer. There may be questions that pop up for you. Absolutely. We're now, thank you. Perfect. Thank you so much. We're going to move to the presentation by Professor Graham Atherton. As all of you know who are joining today, Graham is the founder of World Access to Higher Education Day and the ongoing energy behind this initiative to keep pushing for global recognition of the equity challenges and global dialogue on potential solutions to the challenges that we identify through each of our own work in this area. I'm going to just give you a little background information about Graham as well. Graham studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Trinity College, Oxford, and has been working in the field of education, research, and management since 1995. After 6 years of leading Aim Higher work in London, he founded Access Higher Education and Neon in the UK. He now leads both the Centre for Levelling Up at the University of West London and Neon. Graham holds visiting professorships at Amadou University London, Sunway University Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He's a member of the board of the National Union of Students and has produced over 200 conference papers and publications. Graham, welcome, and we look forward to hearing more about this report and the work that went into it, and especially the roadmap that could help us all support our communities in working our way out of the equity challenges you identify. Over to you, Graham.
Thank you, Roberta. And before we begin, thank you, Roberta, for chairing today. Thank you again, Malcolm, for supporting the report and your colleagues at the Northern Consortium. Of course, as well, Dania, Ivana and David, thank you for participating today across the world. I mean, I'm going to share my screen in a moment and I think go for my presentation, but there's a lot of work that goes into WAHED and has over previous years, and not just from my team, I will come to it at the end, but also, of course, the organisations and colleagues across the world who have made this event happen and brought their willingness and their commitment to the agenda together. And today now is just share my screen, and then I'm going to go through some of the key issues that we identified in the report, and also reflect on some of the wider implications of the report, really, and possibly to provoke the discussion and debate later on. So I do think we're kind of pivotal point, at least certainly where WAHED is concerned, and possibly some of these issues are concerned, really. This is why I posited that the concept of an equity crisis there. I guess some of us would recognise, some of us recognise less, depending on where we are in the world. But looking at it a step back, I mean, despite the progress that many of us have made, and I guess in this conversation today, not just in the panel, but across those who have participated, many of those who in the audience today are those who are committed. They're those who care about this agenda and are making progress in their own environments, be they universities or organisations. But in the context of the bigger higher education sector and society in which HE sits, we have to question, of course, whether that progress at this point is enough. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now and let's look through some of the key issues, hopefully in the report. So, assuming I can find that. Hold on a second. Okay, so in the report there, the equity crisis, higher education access and success to 2030 is going to focus on the presentation today, really. And as I say on the top, thank you to Northern Consortium, and also to my own university, West London, for allowing this work to flourish in the context of their institution. So I guess the questions is where are we now with equitable access and success to higher education? As we'll talk through the presentation, there is a target from UNESCO to one of their global goals to eliminate kind of inequalities in access to tertiary education. But I will say we're quite far away from that. But are we in a position where we really believe we're making the progress that we should do? And both in terms of actual activities, in what the data tells us, and also we look at a commitment by both organisations, universities and policymakers to this issue. That's what I'll explore for the presentation today. I guess the first question is, how did we get here in terms of this piece of work? So I'll give you a little bit of background to both the organisations that I'm engaged with, to give you some context, really, to how we actually undertook this piece of work, allowed us to undertake this piece of work. As Roberta said, I lead NEON in the UK, and it's sort of reflected a bit on NEON, not because many in the audience will be from the UK and will know what NEON does, but it gives us some thoughts about why we have NEON in the UK and why possibly aren't organisations like this in other parts of the world. We're a membership-based organisation in NEON. We're an organisation that supports equitable access to success to higher education in the UK. We have around 150 members of 100 universities. They pay a subscription fee to engage in the activities that we provide. These include professional development, particularly a range of professional development courses over the course of any particular academic year. There's some examples there. For instance, we have courses on outreach work with disabled students, supporting their progression to higher education, evaluating the impact of equitable access work. Of course, funding of this work is significant, relatively, I think, in the UK. It's important to understand what works and what doesn't. We have a series of one-day summits and conferences, an annual conference we have, and research and advocacy as well. Many of the things, in a sense, that most professional organisations do. What I guess one of the things to posit is there are, I know, in other parts of the world, similar organisations to NEON. We work closely with the Equity Practitioners Association in Australasia, and in previous WAHEDs, they've led on different particular events, and hopefully some colleagues from EFIA will look at this report and look at his presentation either now or later on. So there are other organisations across the world like NEOM, but there aren't that many. That's one of the things that we're considering later on. But why is it that we don't have organisations, national organisations, that are bought into by institutions in other parts of the world on this particular agenda? That's an important thing to consider. And what is WAHED? I know many of you on the call today possibly participated in WAHED activities before, been part of our online conferences, but for those of you, maybe it's the first time, but because at this point in WAHED, it's reflecting, what is WAHED and what's it's done. I guess, what is the background to WAHED? I mean, the background is that in the mid 2010s, I was involved in a couple of global conferences on higher education equity, physical conferences, and they were very challenging things to organise, particularly because many of those who wanted to participate were unable to travel to particular locations in the world because budget was an issue. But unlike some other parts of higher education, where there are significant grants and support available to undertake research, etc., there perhaps isn't that same sort of funding available in this space. So we felt if we want to provoke and stimulate and engender global collaboration and conversation and dialogue, we need to think about a different way to do it. So we thought about having a global day of action, where we sort of allowed to be a focus, a catalyst to address inequalities in access and success, to bring people together in a different way, particularly enabling people, and has been done particularly over previous WAHEDs, to undertake activities in their own locality, in their own university, in their own organisation, focused around access and success for equity priority groups, but using the WAHED banner. And that's been quite probably one of the more, in my opinion, the most successful part of WAHED. It's enabled things to happen that maybe wouldn't have happened before in parts of the world, because the WAHED stimulates thoughts and activities on the particular day. We've also engaged with a considerable number of organisations through WAHED, and over the past 3 years, had very large online conferences, as, again, the pandemic has legitimised, if you like, this form of communication. And as well as the activities, we've also produced a global equity map, a database information on higher education equity policies in over 100 countries, based on two particularly large pieces of work, which I'll actually come back to a little bit later on. So that is WAHED, or that is WAHED up to now. And today, as well as our event today, we also have with colleagues in UNESCO and in Latin America and the Caribbean, who are leading on another event after this, 15 minutes after this one finishes. I'm sure many of you were going on to that event as well. And if you registered for that event as well, please try and stay on what will be, I'm sure, a very, very interesting conversation where there's some really innovative and unique work going on in that space, in that part of the world. So that's what gives the background to this piece of work. Why does equitable access and success matter as well? What also brought us here, I think? Well, I think the report has more a background, if you like, not as much as it could be, but giving some justification, I suppose, why equitable access and success in HE matters. But there is, of course, a UNESCO global goal. So if reflecting on that goal, of course, UNESCO has a number of sustainable development goals. Crucially important, as we know that climate change is the most pressing global challenge we face in the world today. But this is also one of those sustainable development goals. And to an extent, it relates to, of course, the broader issue of sustainability, but specific in itself, perhaps lost in those goals to some degree. We're reflecting on that top line there. By 2030, show equal access to all women and men to quality technical, vocational and tertiary education, including university. When we look, I guess, at reflecting on progress that's been made achieving these goals, we think very much about the progress, or lack of it, in terms of progression towards some of the climate change objectives that are embedded in the SDGs. We might argue we're equally far away, perhaps, from achieving this goal as well. What are the implications of that? We'll discuss later on. I mean, we could have a whole separate presentation on why we need to think about issues of equity and access and success in higher education. I'll give us one example in terms of economic and social economic changes, which provoke the need for more higher wage employees. And the need for skills will be very different in a post-pandemic era. And our higher education qualifications comes into that. But of course, as well as that, we may think, of course, across the global south as well, where the focus is very much, of course, on ensuring access to primary and secondary education. But I was reminded by a comment I heard from a colleague at an event maybe 8 or 9 years ago about that particular issue. And they commented that you must build primary and secondary systems in the global south and the developing world. But as well as doing that, if you don't build tertiary and higher education systems, it's like building a pyramid without a roof. Without giving that progression into the sort of areas, sort of knowledge and skill and employment areas, which will dominate the economy over the next 100 years. You're denying those people who enter secondary and primary education the ability to fully reach their potential. Okay, that's how we reached here then, I guess. So what do we do in terms of the project? The project was provoked, I guess, by the pandemic, in the context of the pandemic, and the implications of that for equitable access and success. Because in looking at that, I guess you also think about the enduring and underlying issues. If you look in the report, if you get to read the report, you will see there's an excellent quote from a colleague working in Santander universities in Latin America, who said himself that while the pandemic's crucial, it's only really exacerbated the enduring inequalities in access and access to higher education from equity priority groups. What do we do then? As you'll see here, supported by NGOs Consortium, we read available evidence on higher education participation in these various databases. We'll come on to that in a moment. We examined data we collected on equitable access and success policies, undertook a global survey and some online discussion sessions as well, which brought together around 130 in total people from higher education, from policy, from NGOs, from students. The support of this list of organisations, I'd also like to really thank, I know some of them, of course, are involved in the panel today, but others, such as the Lumina Foundation, European Students' Union, Association of Commonwealth Universities, and the Asia-Europe Foundation, are all strong advocates of this agenda. When I speak later on about the crisis and the need for engagement, I guess it's also in the context of there being organisations that are engaged. And some of those are listed there and have been since the outset of WAHED. So what do we find then? What are the key findings coming from this piece of work? Essentially, there's little chance of the UNESCO global goal being achieved. I mean, if you look at some of the data, I mean, again, this is the context of the availability of data, I must say. You look in the report, but we talk a bit about data. I mean, I produced another report 5 or 6 years ago that looked at the data landscape where higher education participation by equity priority groups across the world was concerned. And I don't think things have changed remarkably since that report, drawing the equity map. It was called, I think, released in 2016-17. The availability of data in this area is limited. Majority of countries aren't collecting and publishing information that they, from their own systems, if you like, on higher education participation. Most of the work, there were evidence is drawn from broader social surveys, which ask people about their educational experiences, which is a valid way of collecting information, but it's also riven with some difficulties, as obviously people's definition of higher education can be very different across individuals, their recollection of experiences differs as well. But nevertheless, in terms of the patchiness of data availability, which there really is across the world, where we do have data, the situation is striking. I mean, we did a small bit of data collection for the report ourselves there, drawing from the CEDLAC database, which you can see in the report. You can see some of the gaps between low wealth and high wealth quintiles there. So what that graph shows you is participation rates amongst the highest, the wealthiest 20% in the populations, and participation rates in higher education amongst the lowest 20% in terms of wealth. And you can see the state of the gaps. Even in Chile, where the gap is the smallest, it's around 30%. In Uruguay, it's around 60%. So equalizing those gaps by 2030 is not going to happen. Okay, what also do we find? I mean, again, in reviewing our own particular work that we've helped bring together in this area, a lack of commitment to this issue from national policymakers. Jamil Salmi, and many of you on the call will be familiar with him, I know, who was, of course, head of global tertiary education at the World Bank for many years. produced an excellent and significant report for World Access to Education Day with support of the Lumina Foundation 3-4 years ago, where he brought together information from 73 countries on their higher education policies with regard to equitable access and success. Now, only 11% of the 73 countries which Jamil surveyed had a comprehensive equity strategy. Another 11% had a policy document looking at one particular group. Now, I also myself led on a piece of work 3 years later after Jamil with the support of the Age of Europe Foundation. That piece of work looked at 51 countries across Asia, Europe, found slightly more had an equity strategy. But still very much minority of countries have a specific equity strategy. And not only that, while only a small number actually have a strategy, we have far less information on whether those strategies are being implemented, whether they're being successful, how much they're being resourced, etc. Now, we also know, we may know in policy, that there is obviously a difference between what is presented in a policy and what actually is implemented. But given there's always probably going to be less of an implementation than there is policies written, there will be a gap between what policymakers say and what they do. Generally, they do less than what they say. But if only a minority even saying they're going to do it, that leaves you some thoughts about what actually is being done, which is even less than that. Okay, let's move on now to the actual primary work that was done for this piece of research, and look at the first big issue we took up in our global survey, where we tried to investigate with those who responded, which groups are most affected by the pandemic in terms of equitable access and success to higher education. What we found was that lower socioeconomic groups were the group that they felt was most affected. We also see, what we did there was we ranked the answers to people asked to rank in order of preference, which they think is the most affected, and the second most, etc. We turned that into a ranked score. And as you see, socioeconomic background, or also lower socioeconomic backgrounds are those who are most affected, and those specific ethnic backgrounds, female students, etc. So down to another grouping. So what we see there is that, particularly again when we consider the issue of collecting data, now we think about groups. I mean, there's intersectional issues here. I'm sure we will explore these in our discussions later on. With intersectional issues of identity, in reality, of course, none of us is just one of these particular facets of identity, and always just a socioeconomic background or gender, etc. But nevertheless, it does give an insight into where we see some of the real impacts. It's important to think about these impacts of the pandemic as well. I mean, Roberta made a very good point in her introduction that in our keenness, I guess, to return to providing that kind of higher education experience for students that moves on from the pandemic after we know the challenges were there. But perhaps keen, not in some senses, not forgetting it happened, but cannot also be, as we'll see in the next few of these slides, forget the implications of the pandemic. What the report brings out well, I think, particularly in the qualitative section and some of the focus group comments, if you get to read it, is the enduring impact the pandemic will have on progression in equitable access and success. Where there is better data than there is in terms of higher education progression is in terms of the impact of the pandemic and the impact of inequality on those at school level. And we know there that the impact there has been very significant. Many young people across the world from equity priority groups, particularly in low-income countries, have left school not to return. Those students, therefore, will not like to make it to higher education. So we talk about the pool of available students who could enter higher education from equity priority groups. That's shrunk as students have either left early or left when at the available formal opportunity because of the challenges associated with economic challenges and others related to the pandemic. Or indeed, of course, because of missed schooling, they're not liable to achieve their potential, the grades they require to enter higher education. So this throughput, this impact of the pandemic will continue to be felt in terms of HE progression over subsequent years. We'll come on to that in the next 2 or 3 slides. In terms of the pandemic itself, the majority of respondents felt HE applications have fallen during the pandemic. They also felt, as you'll see in this slide here, this graph, dropout and completion rates, study performance, the select graduate level jobs. For equity priority groups, there's been a significant negative impact across all these facets of the higher education experience. But you know, it's not just about applications. It's what happens to students when they enter. Can they achieve their potential? Can they go on to achieve graduate level jobs? In our survey of respondents, remember, drawn from across the world, they feel that virtually about 80% of them, there was a negative impact on equity priority groups here. The extent of that impact differs. We see over there the extent there. So you look at the column, say on the ability to get graduate jobs, reduced. Okay, the percentage change. Okay, so we see that around a quarter of the participants felt that there would be a 30% or more a negative impact. Okay, so moving forward, what do you see the impact? Again, this is a very strong view from our survey of respondents. By 2025, access, retention, how many people stay in higher education, attainment, how many people achieve, and employment, what they go into afterwards, will fall for equity priority groups. The most common view in terms of the extent of that fall was the reduction of 6 to 10%. So you can see in the middle of the graph with the largest lines, tallest lines. But a significant number of our respondents felt the reduction in access, in those numbers greater numbers that was dropping out, reduction of final degree attainment, entry to graduate jobs will be over 20%. So as we see that, the view that the idea that we're making progress towards achieving equitable access and success for all, clearly, for our respondents, very negative damage caused by the pandemic. At the same time, in our piece of work, as well as looking at painting what is a very challenging picture, we also saw in our focus groups, particular examples of innovation happening. I'll give you some examples there in terms of our survey and our discussions of what is happening across the world to actually address some of these inequities. For instance, University of Free State in South Africa, we give an example of their work, fantastic work, data to enable student success. Those of you who are working in South Africa and know a South African context will know there are large challenges with students from non-white ethnic backgrounds actually completing their studies. But University of Free State achieved remarkable results, enabling many students in booking national trends, enabling students from non-white ethnic backgrounds to actually complete their studies by having a very sophisticated and data-led approach. Look at Santander universities there, and financial support for hundreds of thousands of scholarships and awards since 2005. So we see there non-university actors involved in the space. The Lumina Foundation in the US there, having a national target for adults to have a college degree certificate, industry recognized certification for credential of value by 2025. So Lumina taking a lead in a particular country. And policymakers are engaged. The position before where we say minorities are engaged, but those are engaged, really are trying to take the agenda forward. In Ireland, for instance, they've just launched a new 7-year national plan that aims to increase new entrants into higher education for the most socially, economically disadvantaged areas by 12%. And European Commission, across Europe, the European Commission is leading on collaborative work to try and support and enable countries to develop their own policy commitments, their own indicators of success, and really support and commit to this agenda of equitable access and success in higher education. But nevertheless, the innovation is happening. We are facing some real major challenges if we want to take the equity agenda forward. So what does the report recommend that we do? The report has 3 calls to action. Firstly, it recommends creating a global task force, essentially bringing together those organisations and universities committed to equitable access and success together and to show leadership. My overall message from this presentation, I guess the report itself, my reflections were, there's a need for leadership on this agenda. There is commitment across the world to this, but we're seeing major challenges. I don't think we really allowed ourselves to really sink in what the impact of the pandemic may well be on equitable access and success and progression to higher education over the course of the next decade. We've lost many, many potential students from equity priority groups who enter higher education. Not only if they enter, the ongoing impact, the economic impacts coming through, as we're facing real major economic challenges across the world in subsequent years, will affect their ability if they enter to even continue and succeed. Those committed to this need to come together now. Engaging students, engaging broader civil society and employers in this question to make visible goals and create that leadership that's really required. Investment. I guess reflecting back before we just talk about this more specifically to our work on equitable policies. Well, a minority of countries have equity policy strategies. The majority of countries that Jamil and I looked at did have a reference to equity in their higher education policies overall. But references aren't enough. We need resources and commitment. It's okay, you know, to say that we're committed. I know many people inside and outside of higher education would not say that there should not be a commitment. They wouldn't support opportunities being offered to those from particular groups, particularly disadvantaged backgrounds or minority backgrounds, to enter and succeed in higher education. But those words won't make change. We need resources. So we're asking about this idea of asking for a 5% commitment. And indeed, does that look like a huge commitment? I'm sure some university leaders will look back and sit down and say, well, there's no way that we could commit 5% of our budget to this. Well, of course you can. You've got to spend less on something else. Governments have said they can't spend 5% of their higher education budget on this. They can, if they wanted to. The main idea that I guess that one has to push universities to do this is worth reflecting upon as well. Shouldn't it be part of what universities do? Should it be part of how education believes in, offering opportunities to all? The report also outlines some further ways in which, of course, one would use these resources to make change, particularly through how we deliver our teaching and learning, how we work as universities and university sector, as schools and colleges take responsibility for the throughput of students. And as we've mentioned today as well, how we take all aspects of what higher education does well and look to make that open to all, particularly, of course, including internationalisation as an example. And many, as we say, are committed to that, but more need to be done. And finally, targeting as well. I think particularly we won't achieve some of these changes till we really see the tangible commitments, and targets is a way of doing that. Data does drive change. And I think, well, we did see on the presentation using some of the data we have available to us, which suggested, I mean, pretty clearly we won't achieve possibly our targets in terms of equitable access across socioeconomic background, which is the key driver at the end of the day. There's a need for much more data collection. Not just collection, actually, but bringing together what already exists. I mean, my perspective is that there is actually data information out there, but is it being shared, is it being brought together? Is it a basis to actually set goals and targets for policymakers and leaders to move to? And finally, I want to reflect, I guess, on where we are in our journey in WAHED here. Earlier this year, we tried to launch something called the World Access to Education Network. Because while with the support of the organisations I outlined earlier, and particularly, again, Northern Consortium, and also Northern Consortium, other organisations working in this space, we've been able to deliver WAHED for the past 5 years. We're at a point now where we really do need to come together if we want things like WAHED to continue. Is this indeed the last time that we're able to take WAHED forward? We hope not, which is why we launched the World Access to Education Network. Because important as a global day of action is, this issue needs, as all of our parts of our education do, to make change. Ongoing work, as we've tried to do in NEON and others, our colleagues across who bring organisations of practitioners and universities together across the world have tried to do so. So we tried to launch a global membership network to support equitable access and success in higher education, offering professional development opportunities, the exchange of practice and knowledge, research and evidence gathering opportunity, and also a platform for advocacy and campaigning on these issues. The ability to join is there. Because while the 3 previous recommendations and calls for actions are crucial, bringing the community of those engaged in this issue together is also fundamental. We hope that over the past 5 years, WAHED has made a contribution. We hope it's enabled and fostered dialogue and enabled people to think about and see all the things that happen across the world and use that in their own practice. But as in other parts of higher education, to drive change, we need to work together. And I guess our final reflection is there a commitment to do so? I hope there is. I hope we're able to continue to do this work. But I think now, I guess, the ball really, essentially, like it never has been, as they say in the UK, is back in the court of you in the audience and our colleagues, if we want to take this sort of agenda forward. Thank you, Roberta, and I'll hand over to you and then to the panel.
Thanks so much, Graham. Thank you for such a thorough presentation of both the background and the contents of your report, but also the findings, because I think what we're all most curious about are what are we missing as we implement our own actions to try to improve equity. Something is missing because we take 2 steps forward and 2 steps back, and we somehow are not able to really leap in the agenda forward so that we see equity making huge strides in changing the numbers. And that's sort of the game that I'm in as well. We monitor the numbers. And one of the issues that came up very clearly from your presentation, especially, is that more work needs to be done on the political economy of equity, because where we really can influence financiers, right? Policymakers, Minister of Finance, Minister of Education, and politicians whose necks are on the line when they make huge spending decisions about public money, is that equity actually has real social and private benefits. And that's a lot of the conversations around returns of investments in education. But we can do more with this data, because we know anecdotally that it's massively important, but there needs to still be more research, I think, that can allow for big decisions to be made about funding. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, money has to go into this, and not enough is being spent on equity, in my opinion as well. So if you have questions for Graham, please put them in the Q&A, where we don't have time for them right now, but we'll turn to them at the end of the session. I'd like to turn now to our panel discussion and introduce to you all our 3 speakers for the panel today. And first, I'd like to introduce David Locke, who is the Secretary General of the Magna Carta Observatory. David has had a varied career in international higher education and university leadership. As the Director of International Projects at the UK's Leadership Foundation for Higher Education, David was responsible for instigating and delivering projects with over 30 different countries, some at the government level. Projects have included major programs for rectors and ministry officials to implement national higher education reform and autonomy strategies over several years. Until 2007, David was the founding registrar and acting chief executive of the British University of Dubai. And he is the chairman of the Gulf Education Conference and serves on the International Advisory Committee of the British Council. Welcome, David, who has been the Secretary General of Magna Carta Observatory since 2014. I'd also like to welcome Dania Matos, the Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion at UC Berkeley in California, USA. Dania began her tenure as the 4th Vice Chancellor for the Division of Equity and Inclusion at the University of California, Berkeley. I am a Stanford graduate, so I might have opinions about Berkeley, but I'm very happy to welcome Dania here. Prior to coming to Berkeley, she was the inaugural Associate Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of California, Merced. She is a member of the Chancellor Carol Christ Cabinet, advising and guiding the campus on diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice. She's the co-chair of the Hispanic Serving Task Force, oversees the African American Initiative, and is the executive sponsor of multiple identity-based standing committees. Welcome, Dania. And finally, I'd like to introduce to you all Ivana Radonova, the state expert from Higher Education Directorate at the Ministry of Education and Science, Bulgaria, and the co-chair of the Bologna Implementation Coordination Group. Dr. Radonova was the national coordinator for the HE Innovative Review in Bulgaria and deals with the topic since 2013 till the present. She is a member of the 2018 Bulgarian presidency of the Council of EU team at the Ministry of Education and Science, the Bologna Follow-Up Group, and the Bologna Follow-Up Group board member and co-chair. She is also co-chair of the Bologna Implementation Coordinating Group since its establishment in 2018. She has been part of the Higher Education Directorate of the Ministry of Education and Science for more than 14 years, and her activities are mainly related to the international dimension of the sector, national legislation, entrepreneurship, and the links between the education and labor market. Welcome, Ivana. So David, I will turn to you. I think you each have presentations that you'll be making, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end and a panel discussion. So David, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Roberta. And may I start by congratulating Graham and NEON and WAHED as a concept. Magna Carta Observatory has supported WAHED from the start and has been very pleased to do so. And we were very pleased when Graham came to us and said, look, would you help us facilitate a little bit of this project? And we were very happy to do so. What I'd like to do now for a few minutes is just say, well, why is this relevant to Magna Carta Observatory? What can the observatory and the Universitatum actually add to all of this? And I'll conclude with some steps which I think universities can take. Magna Carta Universitatum was born in 1988, and it was born because there was unrest in Europe about governments being intrusive into universities in different ways. And the sector, universities, got together and produced this great charter, the Magna Carta Universitatum. And I'm not going to read it out, you can read it on the website, but I am going to pick on one of the key principles, the first principle, and that is that universities are independent and their independence must be protected. Now, of course, a lot of time has passed since 1988. The world's changed in many ways. And in the run-up to 2020, the Observatory Council said, we need to revise this. And it was revised in a very different way. Instead of 7 learned men who addressed each other in Latin, talking together, we went for a multinational group which comprised students, staff, rectors, and so on. We did a lot of surveying, we spent quite a lot of time together, and the Magna Carta 2020 was created. Now, it took nothing away from the principles of the 1988 document, but it added some very specific things which are very relevant to what WAHED does. The first of these, which is set out specifically, is the potential of higher education to be a positive agent of change and social transformation. Right? But more than that, universities acknowledge that they have a responsibility to engage with and respond to the aspirations and challenges of the world and to the communities they serve to benefit humanity and contribute to sustainability. Now, to fulfill their potential, universities require a reliable social contract with civil society, one which supports the pursuit of the highest possible quality of academic work and with respect for institutional autonomy. And then, more specifically than in the 1988 version, universities are non-discriminatory spaces of tolerance and respect where diversity of perspectives flourishes and where inclusivity, anchored in the principles of equity and fairness, prevails. They commit themselves to advance equity and fairness in all aspects of academic life, including admissions, hiring, and promotion practices. Still better, education is a human right, a public good, and should be available to all. All right. And then there's a statement at the end, and I should say that over 960 universities from 94 different countries have signed the Magna Carta. What it says is this: by signing the Magna Carta Universitatum 2020, universities declare their commitment to the original declaration and to upholding and advancing the principles, values, and responsibilities stated above, 6 of which I have read to you, to strengthen the role of universities in the preservation of the planet and promoting health, prosperity, and enlightenment around the world. Now, it's one thing to have a document which sets that out very clearly. It's another thing for universities to actually take action on that document. And there are 2 things here that the observatory is doing. The first is that it has developed what is called the Living Values Project. Details of that are on the website. And what that enables universities to do is to take a look at themselves, a look at their values, a look at the extent to which they are putting those values into practice, and then to amend what needs to be amended so that they can be more effective in the fulfillment of the Magna Carta which they have signed. Secondly, and this is in the process of being announced, we are going to invest in some research. The title of that research is The Responsible and Responsive University. And we want to engage signatories in that. And I would be very happy if some of that engagement was around the theme of this conference. But let me finish with 5 points, things that I think universities can do to try and have greater impact in this area. First is to review their values and to ensure that equity features there and is actually being implemented. Secondly, to engage with staff and students and their stakeholders to ensure that that value is known and is lived. Next, to allocate resources and to adjust their procedures so that recognition is given to staff and departments that put this objective into practice. Next, that requires leadership. And from the observatory, we would be very happy to contribute to the development of that leadership. But the last of my 5 points, it's not quite off the wall, but it's think outside of the box. From my career, I've seen a number of ideas that people initially thought were wacky, which actually came to have a major impact in the way that universities did things. And some universities can be quite slow to change, even today, but we should be open to those new ideas. Now, just to conclude, Ron Daniels, president of Johns Hopkins University, was the keynote speaker at our big conference in September. He said in an article yesterday, universities have to reclaim their role as sites of accessibility, free expression, and as bastions of truth, where truth is always subject to vigorous contestation and revision in the light of new methods and so on. To meet these challenges, universities must begin by investing more resources in access and financial aid, and by expanding recruitment effort and developing policies that enable more young people to attend universities. I think Graham and Neon have done an amazing job in raising awareness. And I think it's now for universities to exercise the freedom which they have, review their values, and to improve access and equity.
Fantastic, David. Thank you so much. I hope you'll be able to stick around for the Q&A at the close of the panel, because I'm sure I will have lots of questions, but I'm sure questions will come from the participants as well. Thank you. And now over to you, Danya, for your contributions all the way from California. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roberta, the World Access at Higher Education Network, Graham and David, for those remarks. And thank you to all of you for being here. I am not a morning person, so you know I am committed in embodying this by waking up at 6 a.m. today, just to be with all of you. I also would be remiss not to recognize my team in the audience. So go Bears. I know we have a big game on Saturday, Roberta, but I had to take a moment of privilege for that. I think it's important to also situate this a little bit in centering people, right? Because we keep talking about institutions as if they exist in this vast void, but institutions are comprised of people, all of us leaders, folks like me. We did share that I am in the context of the United States, and I think, you know, bios don't always do people justice. So I always like to share a little bit of that. I'm a legal scholar practitioner as well. And so I really situate this in the context of the United States, right? And in the building of it. And the situation of really being founded on access for some and not access for all, and the codification of the policies and practices that led to that, including the exclusion in higher education, right? Of who could attend, of whose knowledge was valued, of who we center at that. And that very much still exists, including at places like Berkeley, which have been around for centuries. And so really thinking about, we as human beings created that false belief in human value. We as human beings created that false belief in racial hierarchy. We as human beings created that exclusion in that. So we as human beings need to be the people to undo it. And so you'll see in the United States, there were lots of movements for creations of different disciplines like ethnic studies, centering intersectional identities and all those different places. When we talk about the pandemic, we talk about both the dual pandemic, not only of COVID-19, but confronting our enduring legacy of slavery, and also sort of the murder of George Floyd and countless others in that. And so for us, it's really something that for some, we've been battling from our inception. And for some, there was an awakening of a subconscious or consciousness around it. And that becomes really important to situate the conversation is. I myself always introduce myself. I'm Black Latina from Puerto Rico, still a colonial subject of the United States, but also someone who was raised by a single mom who sacrificed everything for that education and those pieces, right? So this embodiment of leaders who show up authentically and transparently so that students can be what they can see and recognize that they're a space. We create mirrors and reflections for people to show up as themselves. So I think that becomes a really important piece of this equity conversation and equity gaps. So one of the things I also like to ground a little bit in is Bell Hooks, trailblazing feminist scholar, talked about the purpose of education being critical inquiry, right? And not situating education as just a one-way relationship where we're educating students, but recognizing that we are not just community centers, but places that center community. And in that, there is this reciprocity of educating that happens, right? Where we are also gaining from the students, staff, faculty, and community members that come and situate in that. Berkeley is a public institution as well, right? So there's this commitment to the public and centering that public good that comes with that. And so you'll see that what ended up happening is divisions like my own of equity and inclusion, vice chancellors for equity and inclusion, head diversity officers, these roles started beginning to be able to do that and really center on what is it that we mean, not just on equity and creating access, but really thinking about this concept of belonging, because access isn't enough. Really thinking about how belonging means more than just being seen or having access. Belonging is about having a meaningful voice and the opportunity to participate in the design of social and cultural structures. It means being respected at a very basic human level that includes the right to co-create and make demands upon society, of which higher education is one of them, right? So to be able to co-create the curriculum, the design, and to recognize that educating does not just happen in classroom spaces, but in all the places that is community. And so for us in this division and how it's built, I have the privilege of leading a division that sits in that third space of creating that. We serve formerly incarcerated students, undocumented students. We have the disabled students program. Our Centers for Educational Equity and Excellence really looking at that academic support for when we say traditional, right? We're really saying cis white men. And that has been centered in access in higher education. So to be able to say that if, as we remove structural oppression for these communities and center them, we really are liberating everyone. And oftentimes as an attorney, when I say justice, everyone goes to sort of the criminal justice system and thinking about those pieces. But I'm really talking about one where we recognize that our own liberation and freedom is connected to the other, right? Is connected to the students. And that's really the pieces that we're centering on. And so there were many things that happened in terms of transformations and shifts during the pandemic, but many have felt that there were things that we needed to leave behind as a society already, right? Greed, sort of this hierarchical placement. But some feel that many have gone back to business as usual, forgetting the goodness, forgetting the many things that we created amongst that. And in my division, we're really situating in a place to hold space for that, right? To really think about how do we lead with love, a word that is not in any strategic plan, but will be in mine, a word that is not really thought about in higher education. So what would it look to do that? In some of my work, we also talk about often first generation undergraduate or graduate students, but we don't think about it as first generation equity practitioners. And that is what many of us are, right? So really thinking about how are higher education institutions developing those first gen equity practitioners, right? What are the questions? What are the spaces you're creating to remake practices and policies, right? It's much easier to do things as they were and to enact policies as they were, but to dismantle things that don't serve anyone really is going to take some really critical conversations, some room and spaciousness to do that, but also recognizing that you need to have some hard and honest conversations about what you're willing and unwilling to trade off. These are things that we have as an institution, as a team, as a leadership, because when the challenge zone comes on how to uphold equity, belonging, and justice, you are going to have to know what that is. Is it ego? Is it pride? Is it willingness to spend more money on something? I think Graham said, you can have the money if you just reallocate resources. And those are those conversations that need to happen within that. And so for us, it really comes to that space of thinking about this concept of thriving, right? I know Roberta shared a little bit of the initiatives I lead, and this idea, even the word initiative has a sense of impermanence, but we are really building this as the sustainable structures to advance and transform higher education institution. So as an example, we think about Berkeley often as a place that has that legacy of serving minoritized communities with a history of activism. It's one of the reasons I'm here, from our disability justice to really thinking about our free speech movements as well. And it has been in place for decades. So for us is really thinking about thriving as being rooted in transforming our ecosystem of services, opportunities, and experiences for equitable outcomes for all members of our campus community. And thriving is someone people get to define for themselves. It's not something I decide for them. And in that, we're creating that co-creation and agency of folks for each other. Another element of that, it means, one example I'll share around our Latinx Thriving Initiative, it's thinking about developing a holistic approach so that every member of our Latinx community feels like they belong at Berkeley. Eliminating the barriers to increase access to opportunities and advancement, supporting culturally responsive practices on wellness, right? We often don't think about the psychological safety that becomes so important in these institutions as well, but also our ethos of honoring Latinx knowledge, experience, and intersectional identities within the community. And that creates the conditions for thriving within the ecosystem. And we have to fulfill that responsibility, especially in a state like California, when 40% of our population identifies as such. And so in centering that experience and dismantling the things that don't make it so, we really are creating environments for all students to thrive, right? Because we're shifting academic practices, right? We are bringing the equity to the data that we've talked about. But one of the things I often say, data drives decision, but storytelling drives commitments. And we need both. And we need to move from the individual to the collective, right? I started with the decolonization as we talk about, right? That not one person holds that expertise, that not one person with, be it titles or letters behind the names, have that, but that in that collective knowledge and the collective expertise, we are really situating those conditions to thrive. And so that really becomes one of the important ways. I think words like traditional don't do us any justice, right? Because what we're saying is just keeping the status quo. And so for us to eradicate is to really think about fundamentally transforming. You know, things change all the time. The weather changes, the time changes, all those things. But transformation really causes us to have those guiding questions, the development of folks, and also grounding us in what I call the work of Paulo Freire, Brazilian educator, on critical consciousness, right? This active and persistent curiosity and awareness, where we get to transform people and examine the beliefs, practices, assumptions, and norms so that they can recognize how power and privilege operate, contributing to inequality and oppression. And it is in those conversations and that awareness and that development of critical consciousness that we have the transformation that allows for these other spaces, initiatives, and inequities to sort of go away. So with that, it's just a little bit of what we're doing here, and want to thank you. We always say that this is not the work of one division and certainly not the work of one individual, but it's really going to take all of us. So I really appreciate this idea of this global network. I was international relations major, politics, culture, and identity. And so that idea of connecting. I also saw some French and Spanish in the chat. So bienvenidos, bienvenue. I speak all three, and hopefully we are able to translate and create some access around that for this. Happy to take questions.
Super, Danya. Thank you so much. That was a very humanist perspective on interventions to support equity, and it's a nice complement to some of the more structuralist conversations we're having around policy and economics. So I really appreciate the complementarity of that perspective, and it's one I believe in very much as well as a American of multiple racial groups and first generation student as well. So I really just, I love everything about that. And we'll return to you for Q&A at the end of the session as well. So thank you very much. And I will turn now to Ivana from Bulgaria, who will give us another perspective from another region of the world, which is much welcome here. So over to you, Ivana.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. It's
very well.
Always privilege to talk after the others because you can get inspiration from them. So I liked very much one word that Danya used, and it is the word belonging. As a governmental representative from Bulgaria, as you mentioned, quite a different region of the world. I was thinking, how can the government support the societies? And of course, we can report here a number of incentives, number of legislative instruments, framework changes, but who really cares about this? I mean, nobody reads the law, the acts, the articles, and so on and so forth. People do care about the results. And what came to my mind when I asked myself what the governments have to do? I think that the answer is pretty clear. To listen and to support. To listen to the societies and to find out what the real needs are, and then to support them with concrete measures, such as frameworks, funding instruments, and many other things that can be done and implemented at national level that can make the life of the people easier. So in terms of the improving the access, I will give you one example of what we are recently started to do here. It is, I guess that most of you are familiar with the Erasmus Plus program. of the European Union that supports number of incentives, and one of them is the Bologna reforms implementation. Because we have this Bologna process having almost 50 countries involved, we have all the instruments, but not all the countries applied them in a proper way. So it was decided that also funding instruments will be used in order to support the reforms and the implementation, and to raise the awareness, to make it more clear to the people, and so on and so forth. So we started a project. This project is related to the social dimension. And while we were in the previous period, we were giving special stipends to the students. Now we decided to use a little bit different approach. What it is? We understand the social dimension as not only granting access, but also ensuring the friendly university ecosystem, friendly university environment. So people from vulnerable groups, non-traditional students, can feel at home. This means that everybody in the university must understand what the needs of the certain student is. So here within the project, we will elaborate special indicators that will be used within the quality assurance procedures. When the evaluators come to the university, they will be able to measure the level of the entire ecosystem in order to realize if it is friendly to the vulnerable groups or not. Then we will train the administrative staff, the academic staff, and also the quality assurance experts in order to support them, to give them these instruments that can be used while they cooperate with the students. I mean, we can ask the university, is your ecosystem friendly? And then they can say, yes, of course, we understand there is a high need of whatever. But when we go in the classroom, we see that the teacher does not understand that there is a person that needs special support in terms of, well, somebody cannot hear very well, for example, and it's somebody that we have to involve. We have to include. So this inclusion, I would also address something else. We don't really know who will be there in the university in 10 years. I mean, we need to set up the profile of the students then. We need to set up their needs, but also their motivation. Because if we go back like some 50 or 100 years ago, we will see that in the universities go mainly students with good social background, but also students that want to have knowledge. The knowledge itself was the value. Now, what is the value? Why somebody is going to the university? Because of the diploma, because of the personal realization, or the professional realization, because he or she will get a higher salary? Why? What is the purpose of the higher education now? This is something that we need to address, and we need to answer as a very, very important question. I also saw some answers in the chat. I'm sorry, not answers, but questions in the chat asking about the elderly people that would also like to enter the university, but big part of their life is already past, and they are not in their 20s. So what shall be the approach to these people? What we decided to do here is something that is not new for the higher education, but for Bulgaria is pretty new, to set the mechanism for validation of prior learning. So if you are in your 50s and you have learned a lot in informal way, you can go to the university, and then you will start not from the 0, but from level 2, for example. And you will be graduating short terms. These are concrete measures that we can put in place, but I will also echo David Locke's word that we have to examine the status quo and to amend what is needed to be amended. I will also address the report that Graham presented. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, your team, very much, because indeed it raises questions, but it also gives us opportunities to find the proper answers. And as a government representative, I would be very happy to share this with my colleagues, so people not only will be more aware, they will be more ready to find answers for themselves. I think this is the starting point. Why are we in the universities? What do we want from our undergraduates and then for our graduates? And I'm again saying something that Daniel said. This is the word love. Do we love our students? Do we love our colleagues? Do we know why the knowledge is so important? So this is a slightly different perspective than reporting how to say legislative incentives and so on and so forth. I will only share with you something that happened to me today. I was attending a very big meeting with representatives from the European Commission, and they had questions to different sectors. And as you can imagine, for example, the justice or the energetic sectors were more attractive, and nobody paid that much attention to the higher education. For me, higher education is the core because I'm a higher education expert. But for the other part of the society, it was not that important, to say so. And then I realized that people do not always understand the meaning of the higher education. And it is not only about the education, and it's not only about the training and learning process. It's not only about research and innovation. It is the entire society. And if we ask ourselves what is the impact of whatever we do, the impact is big because it reflects to the entire society. One good engineer can build, one not that good engineer can even kill people. So improving the access is important, but also it's important to know whom we are improving the access to. So this is from my side so far, and I will be very happy if there are further questions to elaborate on.
Thank you so much, Ivana. Thank you very much. I actually worked in higher education in Bulgaria for many years as well with the World Bank. So it's a system I know well. And actually, since I have you, I will ask the first question of you, and then I will field more questions from the Q&A. And also, again, audience members, if you want to pose questions in the Q&A, please do. But I would actually like to go to this point that you brought up towards the end, which is about sort of the lifelong learning elements of higher education, because I think it does tie really well too in the points that Dania and David made, which is that, you know, higher education is for whole humans. And we spend a lot of time talking about higher education for employment outcomes. And I do this at the World Bank as well, because that tends to be what convinces people to pay for higher education. But obviously, the whole human is what we're hoping to support through higher education, whole societies that benefit from human satisfaction and education, all of these things. In a country that is actually facing sort of demographic declines, right? Bulgaria sort of exemplifies the challenges of demographic declines globally that then put huge stresses on your higher education system. Lifelong learning is one intervention point that can sort of help, right? Helps sort of solidify higher education in society. Can you talk a bit about the challenges that are specific to a context like yours and how equity can keep coming into the dialogue around supporting higher education for society as a whole?
Well, the biggest problem that people share is the length of the study. So they say, I have no 4 years before me in order to get my diploma, and then another year or two to find a work where I can fit to. So this is something that we will try to address, amending our credit transfer system and setting this mechanism for validation of prior learning. The other thing is that there are a number of funding instruments for people that would like to enter such courses, which is performed by the Ministry of Labor Market and Social Policy. So people can use something like vouchers. But if you want to use such a voucher and you go to a certain course, then you may not see any possibilities for yourself. Even in the universities, there is no high level of understanding of the need to open the access to non-traditional students. Why do we need to do this? If I have a student that will be there for 2 years, well, I will receive less money than if I have a student for 4 years. You know, this is something very, very practical, to say so, or pragmatical. But the other thing that we want to introduce, and we talk very much about it lately, are the micro-credentials. So if a person from a non-traditional group want to enter the university, it's not needed for him or her to stay for the entire course of study. Then they will get some document, some certificate, or whatever, that they have complete this course and they have this and this qualification and this learning outcomes in terms of skills and competencies. So again, these are some very practical examples, but the things that can be done are even more. And I have the feeling that while we are working, we will have more and more inspiration and more ideas. I don't know, Roberta, if you are there. It looks
I think
like
she froze.
Yes.
Zoom life.
Frozen. Yeah, something.
Yeah.
Have we lost Roberta there entirely?
Yes.
There is a blow. There is a blow.
Yes.
I guess in the absence of Roberta, I could step back into the chair. I mean, Daniel or David, do you want to reflect upon Roberta's question then on the issue of lifelong learning?
Thank you. Zoom just kicked me out. So go ahead, Graham. Finish and I'll come back in. Yeah. So somebody just kicked me out. I don't know. That's fine. Keep going and I'll finish my. Go ahead.
Well, in answer to your question, Graham, I noticed the question in the Q&A being struck by my reference to age. Well, it was the Ron Daniels quote, which referred to young people. The full sentence in Magna Carta, which talks about age, I only read the first bit. Education is a human right, a public good, and should be available to all. Universities recognize that learning is a lifelong activity, with tertiary activity as one part of a continuum. Within that one part, universities serve diverse learners at all stages of their lives. Now, if you put that into the context of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the fact that people going to universities now at 18, 19, 20, whatever, are being taught skills that are going to be out of date halfway through their lives, then that does stress the importance of the university being accommodating to people in later life and so on, and the micro credentials. And while I'm talking, that there's one point that I'd like to come back on, which Dania first mentioned, and then Ivana picked up, and that the word love was used. When I set up the British University in Dubai, and when the staff met from many different nationalities for the first time, the first group bonding task that we did was to determine what the values of the university would be. Now, it was a great icebreaker task, meaningful, and it led to a set of values that guided us. And one of those values was caring. Now, some people thought that caring was some kind of soft, soppy statement. It isn't. Far from it. If you care about your students, you do everything that you can to enable them to be successful. If you care about your staff, you do everything that you can to enable them to serve their students as well as they can, and so on. And that word caring created an ambience around that university, which became very attractive and is still attractive today. Now, in a Christian context, we call it love. In a university context, in an Islamic country, we called it caring. But it's the same thing, and it does enable that sense of belonging, which I think is so important.
I think the question was around lifelong learning, right, Graham? If I caught it. Oh, I can't hear you.
Myself. Roberta, the question was around lifelong learning, wasn't it? I think.
I actually was moving to a different topic.
There we go.
Okay.
Well, then
That's okay. Because I want to capture all of them. But I mean, we could go on. I mean, I'm sure for the whole rest of the session on lifelong learning, because it's a major equity consideration. But two people anonymously asked about widening participation, and in two ways. One is informing those moving through the education pipeline that this is a real legitimate outcome that they can be striving toward, and that there are often, when equity is being discussed, there's not enough attention being paid to those who are missing through middle school and high school, secondary school, lower and upper, because they just dismiss the idea of higher education outright before they even get to prepare for it and move on to it. And then the second question was, how do you also overcome issues of opportunity costs of attending higher education? Again, populations that are underserved tend to be a little bit more debt averse and quite worried about not working, because they have a lot of people either who are depending on them, or who they do not want to stress the economic costs of attending higher education. Both ways there are massive opportunity costs. So at an institution like Berkeley, where there are massive outreach initiatives in both ways, maybe describe a bit about what you do for that transitional phase, the retention phase, and also overcoming obstacles to just believing you could do it, to get to higher education and make it happen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Roberta. So one of the things I often say, commitment without currency is counterfeit, right? And I know we're talking about a world access and global education. So many of the policies and maybe restrictions we have in public higher education requires a whole transformation of financial aid, right? And the way that we're able to do it and restructure it. And so we as communities of resilience come up with, our own ways and battles. I wanted to talk a little bit about basic needs, because that's also situated under my division, right? So when we're talking about that, we're talking about housing justice. And again, in California and the rising costs of housing, saying affordable housing is not enough, right? So, because what may be affordable to one might not be affordable at all. And really thinking about how are we also creating the conditions for people to just live and combat both food and housing insecurity, right? I was someone who went to law school at night. I was someone who worked 4 to 5 jobs in my undergrad to help my single mom with my younger siblings. I remember late nights in the retail shop studying for the LSAT, and really thinking it makes you a different kind of leader when you've been hungry and had nowhere to live, right? And really recognizing that that too is a right for people to be able to do that. And that, not having access to those things impacts your ability, right? And I know someone asked about the difference between equity and sort of equality. Really thinking about equality is just giving everyone the same, right? Like you all have the same chance, all those things. Equity is really being specific in the unique needs of that particular person and whatever their intersecting identities come with, and that we take all that in, right? So as we're talking about increasing access in institutions of higher education, it means increasing our equity-minded leadership. It means increasing all of those things so that we are serving students where they are and our communities, because it's not just students battling this, right? If faculty as well, graduate students, staff, right? Those are those different places. So I think it becomes that. It also is, we have a Center for Educational Partnerships that really looks at K through 12 outcomes. And in that, right, particularly in education, while I would love everyone to come to UC Berkeley, we recognize that there's a whole system of places and choices that our students can make. And how do we enable that? And recognizing that we're often taking family and chosen families into a lot of our outreach efforts, and our sense of belonging starts before they even set foot on campus or before they even have that first set of Zoom. It's having those conversations, right? Most of the times, as with my own mother, it was, she wanted to know that I was going to be safe, right? That her child was going to be taken care of, that the harms of this country was not going to step into her daughters and on that campus, right? So we're talking about higher education. We're talking about so many different things that are happening in these places, but that sense of safety as well, you know, be it with campus support, thinking about harms and what kind of harms are going to happen in the classroom or outside of the classroom, and how do we not only mitigate, but create that sense of safety, both physically and psychologically for students. And so again, it is this holistic approach where we're not just tackling, okay, we'll increase the number of faculty in classes and that's it, we're done, right? It's really thinking about what are the public-private partnerships that can happen. As someone who had a multi-sectored career, I'll tell you this, not any one sector gets it right 100%, but I think there's so much possibility. And I know we've talked a lot about missions and values. So for us, it's really thinking about how do we take the aspirational and make it actionable, right? And it is through these policies and practice and really having that be a statewide level, right? With our government and legislature involved. We just got millions in funding from the state legislature to increase our formerly incarcerated students program, our undocumented students program, and that will be a line item in the budget yearly, right? So there's not this sense of having to piece it together every single time.
Super, thank you so much, Tanya. Over to you, David. I have a question that came from the Q&A that I think you are particularly well suited to address, which is, where do you think the biggest barriers are to having equity policies situate themselves in a way that can have some sustainability and impact? The question came, is it at the institutional level? Are the institutions the big obstacles, or is it the government? I imagine it's going to be some combination, but since you've worked on both sides of this, it'd be great to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, I don't actually think there's a single answer to that, because universities in different parts of the world work in different ways. I think universities, in my view, need to be clear and influential about what it is they want to do, and to communicate that to government, to their areas, and so on. And universities, as you know, can be enormously influential within government in different ways. So I don't think it's a this party or that party, but certainly in my book, it's education. It's the universities that need to be taking the lead with policy and need to be making that clear to ministries. So where they are dependent on public funding, then public funding decisions can reflect that need.
Thank you so much, David. I'm going to interject as the right of the chair. I will interject myself, because I'm going to offer just a small shift in perspective from the low-income countries, the developing countries, which is where my work largely takes place. And I will say obviously there's some similarities in the challenges, especially this replication of the elite. I think we see that in higher education around the world, that academic staff tend to feel most comfortable replicating themselves, and equity really does require a willingness or a push from somebody external to force change in the replication of the self in the elite part of higher education. I also, with that, because I work extensively now in Africa, especially, but I worked for a long time in ECA, in both places, conversations of equity are very challenging. In the Europe and Central Asia region, a lot of that is because there's a sense that equity is a constitutionally protected right in itself, and that there's no reason to have interventions to push something that is already guaranteed. Now, we know with the data that's obviously not how it plays out in practice, but there's a belief that there's a structure in place that already guarantees that. And in Africa, and I know we have representatives from universities from Africa in our audience today, there are all sorts of tensions around spending in higher education. What is merit? What is fairness in that space when resources are extremely limited and the expansion needs are quite high, and those tensions are impacting equity quite significantly. So David, I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to work through all three panels, and then Graham, actually, I would like you to come in on this as well, which is to address this idea of merit and the meritocracy and how that relates to equity, and whether there's a dialogue that can sustain both concepts in the same place while still promoting real equitable access and real equitable change to the higher education sector. So David, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, again, I think there are different responses for different countries, different areas of the world, and so on. What I will share in response is that universities need to be creative in identifying that and reaching out to communities and where they are, and getting into those communities which would see universities as some kind of alien place. And it's a simple example. Universities are well known for sponsoring sort of high cultural activities and so on. But I've seen one university sponsor a local football team, take people from a deprived estate into that via the university in the morning, and increase participation and the willingness to come into that in so many ways. And I think that innovation, that sort of way of doing things differently, needs to come into things like, how do you assess ability, assess merit, and so on. There's no easy answer, but being creative and trying to get at what you're looking for, I think, and the willingness to do that and do things differently is an important part of the answer.
Thank you so much, David. Ivana, over to you. Same question. How do we balance this challenge of merit versus equity in our higher education systems?
I am not sure that I have a single answer as well, but having this word meritocracy, I can say that I'm a very big fan of the meritocracy as it is described in the Wikipedia, giving equal access to everybody, and then based on the results you can go further. I think this is very important. Higher education, it's not for everybody, as the vocational education and training is not for everybody, but we must have granted access to each one that wants to be part of the higher education or vocational education and training system. So this is something that depends on the person as a desire. If you want to, then you can go. But you can go only if we have created the proper environment and all the possibilities that are needed. Sometimes we go to funding, but it is much more connected to capacity. And what is very important is to have build capacity within the academia and also the administrative staff. And we also can very much work on student support students. So.
Super. Thank you so much, Ivana. Danya, over to you. Same question.
Yeah, I think the myth of meritocracy is what has allowed the continual perpetuation of these inequities, right? The concept in the United States, I think, first emerged in the pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? So really thinking that one's talent, one's reward, all of those things can get one to ascend, but not recognizing the systemic racism that has kept groups unequal, lack of access to housing, the redlining that has happened on who can buy a home and where they can buy a home, or access to that really does that. And so I think it's a myth that's perpetuated and deeply ingrained in the psyche that allows people to keep people out and keep people to continue to perpetuate white supremacist culture, right? And I think we need to name it to be able to eradicate it. So the idea that we can come and be super talented and all that extraordinary things. Look, I went to an Ivy League, right? I went to law school, right? All these things where statistically I'm in like 1%. Especially now as a wealth bracket. And that is not the story for everyone, right? It wasn't talent. It wasn't all those things. It is programs, systems, and people that created things that allowed me to advance right into those places and possibilities. So I think that the fact that it's just talent alone and that's how we get in is false and something that we actually need to name, because we don't all start at the same place of possibility. Right. And particularly in a place like the United States, that's why I probably loved becoming a legal scholar. I wanted to learn it so that I could change it. Right. And in the United States with Jim Crow's laws and all those exclusionary places, you're able to name and redress it. However, where I think we are is the same barriers exist. They're not just perhaps named in the same way. Right. And around the globe and around the world. And so I'm talking about a US context, but this idea of colorism and white supremacy is a global concept, right? And the systemic racism and how it plays out. I mean, if you look at even which countries, right, in terms of poverty and wealth, that is not the countries doing, right? It is a larger context of the systemic place of inequality. And so I think us naming it, this commitment to eradicate that and how it shows up and how the protection of whiteness can be no more. And that's not just something that happens by whites, right? There are so many people that in doing that, it's going to require each of us to give something up. And that is the place. And I think unwillingness of people sometimes for the greater good and for the collective, be it privilege, right? Be it a little bit of wealth and all those different places. So I think that's the first step.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I address this question as a global question, and I try to address it in supporting investments in higher education. So I look at equity too, not at the student level, although of course I do look at it at the student level, but also at the systems and national levels, because we see globally knowledge-based societies, rich countries are expanding the gap between themselves and poorer countries. And when we have these dialogues around investing in higher education, so from the micro student level to the macro, where does the money go at the national level? A lot of countries are directed very heavily to focus on issues of learning poverty, improving reading at 4, 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 14-year-olds. And that is, of course, extremely important. But if you have a country that focuses the largest number of their resources, the largest amount of their resources on primary education and ignore higher education, you have a country of people who can read at the 4th grade level and very few people who can produce and lead at the highest level that allows that gap between rich countries and poor countries to close. So we see both. We see at the systems level locally, we see it at the global level, these equity gaps are growing. This idea that some countries deserve higher education and higher skills and other countries don't, that they should be the agricultural countries, they should be the industrial countries that are making things. That is still part of a global narrative. And so you see what we're describing at the student level absolutely reflected at the international level and country to country level. And so these dialogues are important across the board, whether we have it as a policy discussion, if we have it at international financing organizations like my own, or we have it on the ground at a campus that's doing great work, that's mission driven to expand access across the communities that they serve. It's the same questions that we're trying to get to. How can we lift the boat across the globe without creating too much space among those who are benefiting or losing in that system? So I want to thank all of our participants today. I've learned so much from you all. I've enjoyed it tremendously. I'm going to leave the last comments to Graham, because Graham is the godfather of this exercise. But I do want to encourage those of you who are participating to follow up at the next session. And I have the information about it here somewhere. I have so many papers. The next session is called Advocating for a Rights-Based Approach to Higher Education. It's going to be led by a team from the Latin America and Caribbean region. It starts at 5:15. So if you have the time and the capacity to join that one, we want to really encourage you to do that. And with that, Graham, over to you for the last 4 minutes or so of summary of what you hope we all got out of this session and what you hope we take with us to our work on our everyday lives. Over to you.
Thank you, Roberta, and thank you for chairing the session so expertly. I think I'd like to return to, to some of the points that came through the discussion, really, and I guess reflecting upon the report. I think the position of higher education is challenging overall, and that relates to equity as well. And I like Ivana's points she made earlier on about when she was in a debate about higher education in a government level and other areas of focus were seen as more important. And I think that really brings us back again to education and equity as well, because for me, equity is not just a matter of how many more students from different backgrounds enter higher education, it's the legitimacy of higher education. Is it a legitimate force? I mean, if you think about this globally, and we touched on some of these points today, certain parts of the world today are facing real, of course, and always have done for decades, real challenges of physical safety and security in many populations. But across from that, we're seeing huge economic challenges enveloping the globe now, as well as major challenges that bring us all together in terms of the climate. Where does higher education sit in that? Higher education wants to be a transformative force. I mean, you think about it overall. I mean, David and I have been to several recent conferences, I'm sure you will have as well, that want to see that happen. But that can't happen if you're only for a certain group. It can't happen if it's like that. And it has to become, I think, the aspirations of the global higher education sector to be a transformative force, it really wants to be that way, is at odds with its inability to address the inequalities in its own backyard, because it doesn't want to talk about them. I mean, we're here talking about that. Our task really is to go beyond the people who attend WAHED and the people on this call today, and many will sign up, hopefully, and will listen to the call on YouTube and on recording, but to bring that broader set of organisations into this conversation. I mean, no matter what happens with WAHED, if the contribution we've made in the past 5 years and through today is to bring more people into that conversation, be that on a local level, be that just to students in their own institution, or be that within their own region, or be that nationally or globally, then hopefully we've achieved something in doing that. Because I think it is about that engagement, that broader engagement. If you come from these things, you do feel that there is people there in the world who are really committed to this, and we've seen this through the report we've produced and the work we're doing. But then again, you step back and then you think, how does that commitment become extended? I guess from the WAHED point of view, we'll look at this report, we'll do what we can to continue this dialogue and this communication, but we cannot do it just as one organisation, and we can't even do it as those who are in this call. I mean, the challenge out to those in the audience today is you're in this call, you're in this discussion today, but if you really want to continue with this concept of global communication, global dialogue in this, how do we contribute actively and then just sign up for WAHED one day a year? Because if you don't, there won't be a WAHED one day a year to sign up to, is the reality. And I think it needs to be that, because there needs to be an international dimension to this conversation. Because not only that, because we can see through the call today, and again for the reports that we've done as a country, there is some fantastic innovative work going on. Even around here, we've got global international funders, we've got government representatives, international organisations, universities who are doing things others could do. But unless other people know about them, they're not likely to do them. And we're not doing this in WAHED. I haven't started this because we have aspirations to lead the world or put ourselves on these platforms. We're doing it because nobody else is. That's reality. It shouldn't be. If there's somebody else could do this better with more resources, then I'm happy to let get over and do it. But until somebody steps in to do that, then we're not going to see that happen. And I believe it has to, because we'll only extend and address some of the issues we talked about today if indeed we're able to communicate and collaborate and learn from each other to find those solutions that fit in our own particular context. There's all things to say before we finish. I think particularly your questions at the end about equity and merit were particularly interesting, I thought, Roberta. And I think a little work that could be done is, I think you made a point in some of the conversations there is we do have a kind of Western European centric approach to some of these things, because there is parts of the world we said in our research that leads on that. But I'm interested to see there is quite a bit of work going on as well in lower income contexts. I'd like to see that shared more, because it feels more realistic to have that conversation. We can have a conversation about what happens in the UK, but that's realistic to some of the countries that you work in, Roberta. It kind of isn't in a way, is it? But there is things happening in other parts of the world that I think we've seen in my work that are, and I'm just to see maybe how those things could help the countries that you're working with to learn from people they feel more realistic to them to work to. Anyway, I guess overall, again, thanks again to all of you for participating. Thanks again to the organisations who supported the research, Northern Consortium, to ASEF, to Lumina, to ACU, to ESU as well, and to all those who supported WAHED so far. Hopefully you can all stay on for the call afterwards. I think it'll be an excellent session. And again, you know, thinking positively, you are seeing a group of organisations, universities and others, they're being led by UNESCO in that region. You know, really do take this, not just, I think, as Danny has said, not just as an initiative, but actually as part of what they're kind of integral to what they believe about what higher education should be. And thank you again, finally, to the team at WAHED, to Mariana and Martin. Without their commitment, on top of what they're doing in NEOM, because I'm pushing to do so, none of this would actually happen. And so thank you all again, and hopefully we'll participate in WAHED again in the future. Thanks again, Roberta, and I guess that's all from me.
Thank you, everybody. Please stay for the next session if you can. It starts in 15 minutes. Take care, everyone. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.